My presentation today is why ICNIRP limits fail to protect public health and the environment. And I should add that in the United States, we have the regulations, the limits for human exposure of the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. They are very similar to ICNIRP limits. Here, what you see is a high school near my mother's house where I grew up, where there is also, of course, a cell tower directly next to the schools. This is happening all over our community. I have worked for years in the issue of wireless and electromagnetic fields, most recently publishing and co-authoring several papers with my focus on public policy. How can we change our policies to better protect the public? So the modern world is filled now with wireless devices from our phones, earbuds, laptops, tablets, Wi-Fi routers, smart speakers, video game consoles, smartwatches, fitness trackers, keyboards that are wireless, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi devices, Internet of Things, and smart utility meters, and of course, cell towers, 4G and 5G. Here's another installation of a 5G antenna right near a house in a community. We are seeing these all over the United States of America. Here are 5G towers in New York City. And as you can see, they are very close to where people live and work. And ICNIRP and FCC limits were not designed for the current technological world that we're in. There are some key problems with these human exposure limits, which are egregious and make these limits indefensible and really inapplicable to human health. To start, they were only designed for health effects related to overheating tissue, and they were not designed to address the biological effects of lower, less non-heating levels. They were not designed to address long-term exposures, nor exposures from cumulative sources, as we described with all of those devices, nor were they designed to address children's unique vulnerability due to their developing brains and their higher absorption. ICNIRP and FCC limits were never designed to address people with medical issues, with pre-existing cancer or autoimmune disease or heart disease or any of the other chronic health conditions that really are endemic in the current modern world. Nor were they designed to protect wildlife or nature. They are only for humans. And of course, they were developed decades ago based on a large adult male, which entirely does not reflect the current world where people of all ages are using devices, multiple devices, be it at work, school, or in recreation. We really can't escape the current involuntary exposure. The science on mobile phone base stations, or cell towers, as we call it in the United States, has been growing for decades. There is a review by Alfonso Balmori, published in 2022, entitled Evidence for a Health Risk by RF Radio Frequency on Humans Living Around Mobile Phone Base Stations, From Radio Frequency Sickness to Cancer. And he reviewed the existing scientific studies on people who live near cell towers or base stations, mobile phone base stations. And he concluded that the majority of studies found effects in three areas: radio frequency sickness, cancer, and changes in biochemical parameters to the blood, for example. The symptoms of radiofrequency sickness included headaches, sleep disturbance, discomfort, irritability, depression, memory loss, dizziness, fatigue, nausea, appetite loss, and difficulty in concentration, and so forth. While ICNIRP would say that these effects are not established, the reality is that there are hundreds of studies that have shown effects, and there have been appeals going back decades, such as the EMF scientist appeal, which states of effects documented in the scientific literature that they include increased cancer risk, cellular stress, increase in harmful free radicals, genetic damages, structural and functional changes of the reproductive system, learning and memory deficits, neurological disorders, and negative impacts on general well-being in humans. And the EMF scientist appeal was signed by 258 scientists from 44 nations who have expertise who have published on non-ionizing electromagnetic fields. Whereas the members of ICNIRP are only about a dozen or 14 members at any one time. There is a very important paper which was published in the journal Environmental Health by the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields, ICBE EMF. It's about how the scientific evidence invalidates the assumptions underlying FCC and ICNIRP exposure limits. They scientifically document 14 flawed assumptions that are the foundation for ICNIRP and FCC limits. And they explain how ICNIRP ignores hundreds of peer-reviewed studies showing adverse effects, as we just described, from DNA damage to cancer risk to neurological impacts and reproductive harm. And they, like many other experts, argue for an immediate moratorium on 5G, for more public awareness of the risks, and for updated safety standards based on the current science. And yet, 5G has been racing ahead, and now we're on to 6G, which is being proposed for the 2030s. It will tie together AI, data centers, and the Internet of Things and support the robot revolution. And in the United States, they are fast tracking cell towers in order to support 6G and AI, and they are trying to remove local, city, and state government authority related to where and how mobile phone base stations, cell towers can be sited in communities. And they're basically trying to strip away the voice of the people in those decisions. So that's something that I've been working on for the last few months. 6G. Dr. Henry Lai regularly looks at the research, compiles it, and looks at how many of the studies report effects versus those which don't report effects. And this is found on Dr. Joel Moskowitz's website at Safer EMR. Dr. Henry Lai repeatedly has shown that the majority of studies report effects on key endpoints: oxidative stress, which contributes to inflammation and many chronic health conditions, genetic impacts, neurological impacts, and impacts to reproduction and development. However, despite this ever-growing base of science, ICNIRP and FCC limits remain focused on heat only, that we don't want to heat our brain like you would cook a hamburger, but they don't address the non-heating health effects, which have been reported and linked to in many studies. ICNIRP's heat-based limits are based on studies from over 50 years ago, from the 70s and early 80s. In these experiments, a few small rats and small monkeys, a few mice and bunnies as well, were trained to press a lever for food. They were exposed to microwave wireless frequencies for under an hour, and their temperature was taken before and after the exposure. The level of adverse effect from exposure was identified at the temperature at which the starved animals stopped pressing a food lever. It is these antiquated studies where animals were exposed for under 60 minutes, under an hour, that are the basis for ICNIRP and FCC limits. From these small studies done many years ago is the assumption that so long as RF, electromagnetic fields, does not heat tissue significantly, then it cannot cause harm. Of course, our modern exposure is entirely different from this scenario. People are exposed 24 hours a day to these frequencies from towers and devices in their homes. Most recently, members of the ICBE EMF published a paper, Dr. Ronald Melnick and Dr. Joel Moskowitz, on behalf of ICBE EMF, where they took results from the $30 million U.S. National Toxicology Program cancer study, which found clear evidence of cancer in male rats, and they applied procedures developed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And they found that current RF exposure limits were at least 200 times too high to protect the public from cancer risk of 1 in 100,000. And that was for 8 hours of exposure. When they analyzed the findings of the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, they found the limits were 4,200 times too high. They conclude in this paper that an independent reevaluation of RF EMF exposure limits based on scientific knowledge gained over the past 30 years and the application of health protective methodologies is long overdue. Because what happened in the United States, at least, is that when the National Toxicology Program study findings were released, they were dismissed. So, this analysis did what our US government agencies should have done to understand what the implications were for human health. Now, there are a lot of issues with ICNIRP limits, especially how they address devices. So, ICNIRP has limits for devices which only look at one device at a time. In this study, published in the International Journal of Electromagnetics and Applications, they looked at the SAR absorption into the human head from just a cell phone, just a Wi-Fi laptop, and then the phone plus the laptop, and they found a 20% increase in the 1 gram SAR into the head. This is a lot, and it's not taken into account with ICNIRP or FCC limits. ICNIRP and FCC limits also assume that everyone responds similarly to RF radiation exposure. But children are not little adults. Children actually absorb more wireless radiation into their brain compared to adults. They have thinner skulls, higher water content, a developing nervous system, and longer lifetime exposures ahead of them. In this study by Fernandez et al., they looked at absorption from just the cell phone and found significantly higher rates into the child brain. Now, the colors you see show the rate of radio frequency absorption simulated with engineering computational models. It goes from yellow to orange, red, purple, and blue, with the lighter colors being higher absorption rates. This study, published in Environmental Research, found a 10-fold greater absorption rate into the cerebellum and bone marrow of the skull, 30-fold greater into the hippocampus, and a 2 to almost 5-fold higher into the eye when the phone was positioned in virtual reality positions, which is right in front of the eye. Even if the absorption were the same, children's brains are more sensitive than adults. And of course, for during pregnancy, it is a time of high and unique sensitivity, a vulnerable time period. Pregnant women are taking phones and resting them on their abdomen, unaware that this is an exposure which could be impacting their child's brain. In this study, published in Cell Reports by Yale researchers, they found the RF exposure from Bluetooth frequency and at Bluetooth power levels. So this pertains to Bluetooth earbuds and AirPods. The RF level was 4,000 times lower than FCC and ICNIRP limits. And they actually found impacted neurodevelopment and increased expression of autism-related genes in laboratory models of the fetal brain. The models that they used were human organoids. This means they didn't use actual human brains, but there are cells that developed into tissues that are tested by researchers called organoids, and that is what was used for this study. So if you're looking at the images, those are images of the neurons. The bottom is the control group, and the top are the neurons which are exposed to radio frequency at the Bluetooth levels which are 4,000 times lower than ICNIRP and FCC limits. One of the challenges we have is that there's heavy industry funding into the research, and studies have found that industry-funded studies are significantly less likely to report adverse effects. Higher quality independent studies tend to show a stronger link between long-term mobile phone use and brain tumors, while studies with industry funding report no significant associations. However, that has clouded the science because there are many industry-funded researchers or industry-tied researchers which are of the opinion that all of these studies that show harm are not enough to change their limits. And they point out all of the problems in those studies, rather than equally pointing out the serious limitations in the heat-based limits that we have. And so this is what we're seeing in the United States. Cell towers going up right in front of the bedrooms of children, right outside windows in our living spaces, all over the country. The push to fast-track cell towers and mobile phone base station is being done by the FCC, which this Harvard report calls a captured agency because there is a revolving door between industry and government. This Harvard report compares the wireless companies' tactics to big tobacco, to the cigarette companies, in the way they are pushing deregulation at the expense of public health. Massive lobbying of our elected officials and heavily funded public relations efforts are involved, funded by the telecom industry. There's also attacks to the credibility of scientists who find effects in their research. And there are many misleading statements of safety which are being put forward, even though there is no consensus for safety. There's also legal bullying, where cities and towns are told they will be sued if they don't allow a tower where the wireless company wants it. And there's this massive push to deregulate cell towers and wireless infrastructure in the United States. And we see this in countries all around the world where, like Italy, which had more stringent limits, now they're being loosened because of the intense lobbying by the companies. Companies which are saying, we can't roll out our technology unless you loosen your limits. ICNIRP is a private group that lacks oversight. They are accountable to no one. Over the years, several members have had ties to industry and telecommunications companies, creating clear conflicts of interest. They are a private group of 12 to 14 people, not hundreds. They function without any kind of scientific or legal oversight to check that what they are saying is in line with public health protection, which it is not. And there's no external review process where scientific experts can comment on what they are putting out before it becomes their final document. And many governments just embrace ICNIRP limits and take them as their own without adequate review, oversight, and public participation in that process. And of course, the participation of scientific experts. There's also no transparency or control over lobbying or industry influence because we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. There's a 2021 report by European members of parliament called the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, Conflicts of Interest, Corporate Capture, and the Push for 5G. And they accuse ICNIRP of being under the influence of telecommunications industry and ignoring the science showing their harmful effects, stating, the scientific debate has been hijacked by corporate interests from the telecom industry and conflicts of interest. They say ICNIRP pretends to be scientifically neutral and free from the vested interests of the telecom industry. We show with this study that this is playing with the truth or simply a lie. And there are numerous publications on the inadequacies and conflicts of interest of ICNIRP by researchers in Australia, by Dr. James Lin in the United States, by groups in Norway, and of course, in Italy, where there has been so much work done for decades, appeals for decades, scientific research for decades on this very important issue. Dr. Franz Ottelkofer, a German medical researcher who's best known for the EU-funded REFLEX study and who long directed the Pandora Foundation for Independent Research, who sadly passed away in 2022, he states, sowing doubt is industry's business. It looks as if ICNIRP is once again used by this industry to enforce its interests, and this time with a method copied from the tobacco industry. By sowing doubt for decades, the tobacco industry succeeded in keeping people unsure about the already certain fact that smoking causes lung cancer. Now the mobile communication industry uses the same tactic, and this with even more dire consequences. The addiction might be comparable, but the number of addicts is far higher. Now, in the United States, we sued the FCC, which has limits like ICNIRP, stating that they had not properly reviewed the regulations for human exposure. And in 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, that is a court just below the Supreme Court, they ruled that the FCC's decision to keep its 1996 set wireless limits was arbitrary and capricious. They found that the FCC had not provided evidence of properly examining non-cancer impacts, impacts such as to the developing brain, neurological impacts, reproductive impacts, impacts to the immune system. They hadn't addressed long-term exposure, children's vulnerability, or how their compliance tests were relevant. They also stated that the FCC had completely failed to address environmental effects. Now, the court ordered the FCC to address all of these issues back in 2021, but the FCC has not addressed any of them. They haven't responded to the court order. And this is a really important gap in protections for ICNIRP as well as the FCC because neither of them address impacts to wildlife. They have no safeguards in place to address nature, birds, bees, trees, wildlife. These images are from an EU-funded study published in Scientific Reports on 4 insects. Smaller insects absorb 5G higher frequencies at a much higher rate because they are smaller, so there's a resonance effect. And they found that insect exposures to 5G's higher frequencies above 6 gigahertz could lead to an increase in absorbed power between 3 and 370%. They concluded that this could lead to changes in insect behavior, physiology, and morphology over time. And yet, these new frequencies are being rolled out all across the world. There's a very important 3-part review by Levitt et al. On impacts to flora and fauna, which documents the scientific literature showing biological effects across all taxa and frequencies studied at vanishingly low, very low intensities comparable to today's ambient exposures. What will that mean for our world? And more recently, that group and myself as well co-authored a paper in Frontiers in Public Health entitled How Non-Human Species Interact with Natural and Man-Made Electromagnetic Fields at Ecosystem Levels and Public Policy Recommendations, where we lay out recommendations to governments to protect wildlife and flora and fauna. And I'll quote from the paper: as the current 6th major extinction epoch proceeds, inaction is no longer a defensible response. The unchecked proliferation of electromagnetic fields is compounding the already severe threats facing wildlife. Reducing ambient EMF exposures may help to give imperiled species a greater chance to recover and reverse ongoing population declines. It is critical that we address this issue. Safeguards and public health protections are needed. Just recently, the ICNIRP sent a letter to U.S. Congress and the FCC cautioning that the increased density of cell towers and wireless networks will come at a serious cost to public health and the environment. The paper lays out the importance of moving forward with a risk mitigation approach, meaning measures to reduce exposure, not increase it with more towers and loosening laws, but strengthening our laws to protect public health and the environment, especially for children and vulnerable populations. ICNIRP and FCC limits do not protect people or the environment. Now, the EMF Scientist Appeal requests to the WHO and United Nations that they protect children and pregnant women, that regulations be strengthened, that manufacturers develop safer technology, that the public be informed, and that governments fund research independent of industry, and that the media disclose experts' financial relationships with industry when citing their opinions regarding EMF and health. And also that there be safe zones, wireless and electromagnetic field radiation free areas established so that people can go, especially those, of course, who get sick from exposure, so that they can be safe and have a life. I work with organizations all around the United States as well as internationally in order to elevate awareness on this issue so we can have the needed protections and address the issues with ICNIRP and the FCC. To all of you who are listening, thank you for the work you are doing on this very important issue.